Very often your applications are going to consume data from other applications. We would end up calling these, another word for this is APIs. So your web application might end up making a request to another web application to get some data. So here I actually have a URL for an application which allows me to get this data. And you see that you have a URL here, and we've got API products. And there's some other things we end up getting from this as well. We've got an API for companies. And most APIs are going to have some documentation that you could end up looking at. But let's take a look at products again. So if we wanted to consume this data from our application, what we would have to do is we would have to get that data. And there's a built-in API that's available called the Fetch API, which we could end up using. So the goal is to actually grab that data and display it in this unordered list. So I'm going to put a script tag here. Again, we would probably end up putting this in another file, but just to get started, what I'm going to end up doing is I'm going to call fetch from this API. And I'm going to do that, and let's load up our file here so we can end up grabbing it. So if I do that, I'll see that it is actually grabbing the data. And I could see the response over here. The problem that I'm going to end up running into is that how do I end up accessing that data? So if I just went over here and I said response, so what we'll see if we come back here is that if we look at the console and we console.log, sorry, let's actually console log this. We'll see that what we're going to get back is a promise. And the reason why that's happening is that this Fetch API ends up sending back a promise. It doesn't send back the data yet. There's a couple of ways that you could end up getting this data from the promise. One of them would be to put the word await in front of this. Now, this could seem like a good idea, but we'll end up getting an error. It'll say you can only use await in an async function. So let's create a function. We'll call it load data. And we will put await in front of this, and we have to make this async. So how do we make a function async? We put the word async in front of the parentheses here. And now, if we look at this, we need to call it. We created it, now we have to call it. We'll see that we end up getting a response back. But we don't quite get our data back. So we could go over here and say data, and we know we're getting back JSON data, so we could say response.json. And if we do that, and we console log our data, we'll end up getting another promise. That's because this also is a promise, so this we also have to await. And this is, so we end up seeing our 6 products. So what's actually important here is that if we were to do a console log here, we would end up seeing hello first, even though our function call is above it. And because what's happening with this API is that this API is actually running on another thread somewhere. After it ends up getting its response back, it'll end up running in this thread, but only when it ends up getting its data back. So async and await are used for APIs that end up giving us back promises, and then once we end up getting this back, we could do something along the lines of going in and creating some HTML and saying data.map, which is going to be a product, putting this in a list item, product.name. And if we did that, and we console log our HTML, we'll see that we'll get our HTML back, but it's actually an array. And so we want to basically turn it into a string, because if we turn it into a string, by joining it, we'll have some HTML, and we can end up grabbing our document query selector, grabbing our unordered list, setting its inner HTML to our HTML, and then we'll end up seeing our products. So async await is one thing that we can end up using when we're interacting with asynchronous APIs.